We're going to do like a little question and answer here where I'm going to ask Deb some questions. And my first question is, so you're a person of faith and you're a scientist. Can you tell us a little bit about your faith background and your science? I mentioned that you're an experienced research scientist. We'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Can you kind of introduce us to yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm really glad to be here today to talk with all of you. I grew up in a Christian home and attended an active church. And so I learned early on that Jesus loves me, and I learned about the Bible early on. And as I grew older, I committed my own life to Christ. It was really important to me and to my family that it was my choice, a decision I made to follow Jesus. I also grew up loving science and math. And in college, I decided to major in physics and learned a lot more about science there. I went off to graduate school. Actually considered Michigan State. I came here and visited, but I ended up at MIT out in Boston. And that sounds impressive.
We often get compared, Michigan State and MIT,
Well, actually, as far as the astronomy programs, my field, they're not so far off. Yeah. So at MIT, I got into studying astronomy. And enjoyed what I was learning there about the universe. And for me as a Christian, I was discovering these wonderful, amazing things out there, like neutron stars. Have you ever heard of a neutron star? No.
I probably have, but most of
you have not heard of a neutron star. In a neutron star, you have the mass of an entire star, like the sun, all squished down, really compacted together to like 10 to 15 miles across. So it's incredibly densely packed together. And so if you had just a teaspoon of that material, it's as much mass as a whole mountain. It's just amazing. There's these things in the universe that we didn't know about until recent decades. And it's a privilege to be able to study those as an astronomer and tell you about the amazing things God has made in the universe. So we were singing earlier about the heavens declaring the glory of God. And I saw that I see that at Lake Michigan. You see the beauty of nature around you, but I also see it in my research and the amazing things out in the universe. But also I was discovering that the universe was old, and I grew up hearing and believing that the universe was young, just about 6,000 or 10,000 years old, that God created it in 6 24-hour days. And here I was seeing so I had to figure this out. So I looked hard at the science, and the more I looked, the more I saw that there's just all sorts of different kinds of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion, that the universe is billions of years old, and the Earth is too. So then I took a hard look at the Bible, too. I read it carefully. I started reading biblical scholars and learning different interpretations that Christians have held over the years, and learning about what the cultures were like back at the time the Bible was written. So through all of that, I came to see how these things could fit together better. And I was able to hang on to my faith. But, and then I went to the people back home and said, well, hey, I think, the universe began billions of years ago. And like, well, you still believe God created it, right? I'm like, yes, of course. But so it's kind of sad in our culture that has become so separated, that the timing of an age of things can, that people associate that with whether or not God created. And I believe with all my heart that God created this universe. It wasn't always easy on campus either. There was one dinner conversation where the topic of Christianity came up, and I mentioned I was a Christian. And one of the professors that said, and he had known me for years at that point, he said, "Oh, Deb, stop talking. I don't want to hear any more, because then I might disrespect you." So he really thought it was just incompatible to be a Christian and to be doing serious astronomy research. Fortunately, other people at the table wanted to hear what I had to say, so I had a chance to share my faith a little bit there. So let's see. Then I went off to work. I started at Calvin College, where I was a professor of physics and astronomy, and my husband was as well. And I taught there for 14 years and spent a lot of time helping students work through these questions of science and Christianity. I also continued my research there. I studied galaxies. So my favorite things in the universe are the really big things, the largest galaxies in the universe, full of trillions of stars that are way out there, billions of light years away. And
sorry to interrupt you. You study galaxies. Can you kind of dumb it down?
Yeah,
what does that mean? Like, do you just look at a telescope every night, or like,
Yeah. So I do love looking through telescopes. I was studying things so far away that they're too faint to see even with a telescope, like one that you could use with your eye. So we use really big telescopes that are on the tallest mountains on Earth, in Chile and in Hawaii. No, I did not get to travel to these places. Oh. They're incredibly sophisticated telescopes at the top of mountains run by technicians. So, but they're big. The mirror is like 10 meters across, so that's like as big as this whole space, is this huge mirror, and so it collects all that light from these very faint things very far away and makes a picture that I then study in my work. So a galaxy, we live in the Milky Way Galaxy, which has about 10 or 100 billion stars in it. And the stars you see in the night sky, those are just from our local neighborhood in the galaxy. So it's a bigger thing around us, this big disk about this big. About this, you know, if it was this big diameter, it'd be about this thick. So about as thick as a pizza.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So you've been doing that research at Calvin.
And then I continued that research at Calvin with students, yes. And along the way, we wrote this book, from our experiences talking with churches and students about these issues. Yeah, okay.
I totally recommend this book, by the way. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Great job.
We've got some flyers back there if you want. And then BioLogos got started, and I had this opportunity to do more with BioLogos. So it's exciting to be able to do this now on a national scale and actually international. Through our website, we reach people all over the world, and especially here in North America. And we also have programs that run all over the place, too, for pastors, for scholars, for teachers.
And now you're the president of BioLogos. How did that happen?
Yes, I am. Well, they invited me. I don't know. Yes.
Okay.
I really felt God's call to do this, though. I did not picture myself leaving academia. I liked teaching students and being a science professor, but this was a chance to, I don't know, I felt that nudge from God, that little tap on the shoulder that said, hey, this is what I've prepared you for, and this is what I'm calling, the gifts that you have are going to be able to do this work. So now I'm in this exciting new opportunity. We're a pretty young organization, so we're still growing, and really glad for chances like this to talk to churches.
Thank you. So one of the big stumbling blocks that people have in terms of science and faith is evolution. And as we heard in the video, that's one of the things that BioLogos is really kind of specialized in evolution. Mm-hmm. You've hinted at it a little bit in the age of the Earth, but can you kind of explain to us in dummies language what exactly is evolution? It's very easy to get technical.
No,
non-technical language.
It's very good to have that reminder, because we as scientists just love getting into the details. So
yes, we can start talking another language up here, and it's not fair.
No. So the first thing you have to know about evolution is that people use the word in different ways. So when scientists use the word, they're talking about a particular scientific process, like photosynthesis or gravity. It's a scientific process where there's genetic variation in a species, and some individuals in those species can survive better, and they have more offspring. And so then those genes spread throughout that species, and over time, the species will change. But the other way it's used in our culture is associated with atheism and things anti-God. So you'll hear people saying things, well, I believe in evolution, I don't believe in God, as if they were opposites. And that's like saying, to scientists, it sounds like that's saying, well, I believe in gravity, I don't believe in God. And we all believe that there's gravity and that, there's laws that describe gravity, but we believe God's behind those. So at BioLogos, we think of evolution the same way, that it's a process that God designed and that God used to bring about the life forms we see around us. And it's a little weird thinking of it that way. I wasn't comfortable with it at first. It took me a while to really accept this idea. But I came to see it as God creating just an abundant variety of things. If you think of all the different varieties of flowers that you see, for instance, God didn't just sit there and make one flower. He made a process where you could have this whole variety of flowers filling every possible ecological niche. And so it's neat to think of God creating through these systems. So that's some of what we talk about in terms of evolution. So if somebody asks you, do you believe in evolution? You should turn it around and say, well, what do you mean by evolution? Because if they're talking about atheism, well, then no, I disagree with that. There's some scientists out there who will just be bashing Christianity. They'll bash the idea of God, saying, oh, we don't need that superstitious, old-fashioned stuff anymore because we have science. Well, that's elevating science and evolution into some godlike level, and the scientific evidence itself doesn't point that direction at all. So it's possible to see it in an entirely Christian way and see God as the source of all the things we see around us, including evolution.
So in your answer, you just mentioned scientific evidence for evolution.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that just a little bit? Like
sure.
What are some lines of evidence? Because scientists, it sometimes seems like they just accept it, and the average person,
right.
We want the evidence. We want the data.
Which is really cool. I love it when people ask those questions. Well, how do you know that? Because as scientists, that's what it's all about. We have to have evidence and arguments that back it up. And so in the case of evolution, well, when Darwin first came up with his idea in the 1850s, he was looking at some kinds of evidence that he knew of. He knew about some fossil evidence. You might have heard of his trip to the Galapagos Island where he was studying the finches, and there's different types of finches there, and he could see how they differed from the birds on the mainland, and that helped him see how these species were diversifying and filling those different ecological niches. And he was looking for a way to understand how all the species fit together, and came up with the idea that there is a common ancestor, that all of life is connected, all the life forms. And you looking at the fossil evidence, you can kind of match out how these species are branching and developing over time. And you build this picture of a tree starting from a simple life form to begin with, and gradually becoming all the different branches of mammals and birds and insects and bacteria and all of those things. So what really convinced me, though, because I'm an astronomer, I'm not a biologist by training, so I was just reading books about this, learning about it. What convinced me was that the genetic evidence. So now, Darwin didn't know about DNA. So now we can do genetic testing of not just humans, but all different species. And you can see in the genes how the mutations happen. And you can, with the genes, map out the tree of how, well, these species are more related, and these are more distantly related, and these seem to have the same genetic features showing they had a common ancestor. And you plot out the tree, and it looks very similar. Okay, there's differences. We've learned some new things with genetics we didn't know from fossils, but you get the same general picture from a completely different line of evidence that Darwin didn't even know about. So to me, that was pretty powerful and convincing.
This is a question. You do a totally different type of science than I do.
Yes.
So I ask a question, I go into my lab, I mess around with stuff, and then I see whether my prediction was true.
Yep.
Your research is a little different and more directly related, I think, to evolutionary theory. Can you kind of explain that process and how you come up with data and how it...
Yeah. So just to give you a feel for what it's like doing science research, so Mark will go into the lab and you test it, and you can control everything, and you map it out. Well, in astronomy, going back to astronomy, I can't control the stars. I wish I could. It'd be nice to bring them into the laboratory. Here's a star, put it in a box, and say, okay, now do this and this. And you can't. So all you can do is observe. So we make lots of observations. But when we're doing that, we're still doing the fundamental core of science, which is building hypotheses or theories about how things might work, and then testing them. So I can test things about stars. I can observe one batch of stars here and come up with a hypothesis for how the physics is working in these stars, and say, if I observe these other stars, I bet they'll look the same. And then you go and observe them and go, hey, they look the same as these ones. Or I can say, I bet if we look at a different type of star, it's going to look like this. And you go and you test and go, oh, well, it's not quite, but it's kind of. And then you modify your hypothesis. You do the same kind of thing in your lab, right? Mm-hmm. So that sort of interplay between the hypothesis and testing it with data happens just the same in astronomy, even though we can't put it on the lab bench. And so it's similar for the history of life on Earth. We can't, there's some kinds of experiments you can do. Sometimes experiments inform what's going on, like the genetic testing I talked about. But there's a lot of things we can't control, but we can observe. And so we observe all of it and look at how those pieces fit together. Predict, if we look at this part of the genome, now we'll see this, and that's basically what Darwin did. He made predictions of how this tree of life would look, and then we went and we looked with the genetics, and it followed that pattern.
So we've talked about evolution now, and we've kind of gotten a little background about it. How do you take that piece and combine your faith and kind of put those two together, like taking the creation story and God's role in creation? How do you work that out?
Yeah, well, that's the big thing, and that's what we spend a lot of time doing at BioLogos. One thing we do there is we explain the scientific evidence in a Christian context. But another thing we do is we talk about how does this fit with the Bible, with our theology, with our doctrines that have been passed down through the church through the centuries. And so this takes a while to work out. Evolution raises some challenging questions. But the first questions people usually ask are about the Bible. How does it fit with that? And what I came to understand is that, and this is through reading biblical scholars, so this isn't my area either, but the people back then really thought about our world differently than we do today. So if you think of the Old Testament passages, we're talking about this ancient Hebrew culture there in the Middle East, and they were surrounded by the Babylonian culture and the Egyptian culture, spent time in exile in both those places. And so those cultures, and the Israelites, they had this view of the world, that the world was flat, first of all, okay? They didn't know it was round. And they thought the sun just moved through the sky. They didn't know that the earth moved around the sun. And as bizarre as that is, they also thought that the earth had a solid dome sky over it. And they didn't know it was a gaseous atmosphere. They thought it was just this dome, and above it was another ocean of water, because that's how they explained where rain came from. Because they didn't know what the school kids here know is that water evaporates and it condenses in clouds and it precipitates down. They didn't know that. So they believed there was this ocean above a solid dome sky. Very different picture than we have today. And I finally got what was going on in Genesis 1 on day 2. It says God created a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. I'm like, oh, that's what they were talking about. I could not figure that verse out for a long time. So what I realized then, and what a lot of biblical scholars have pointed out, is that that God didn't try to correct their scientific misunderstanding. God didn't try to explain that the earth is round or that the sky is a gaseous atmosphere. It would have confused them anyway. And instead, God used the language that they understood and said, yep, that firmament you think is there, I created that. I created the sky, the oceans, the land. All of it is from our one God, one sovereign creator. And the big contrast, the big message those Israelites would have heard when they first heard that story was how different it was from the Egyptian and Babylonian stories, because those stories are full of idols, all these other gods, pagan gods. They had a separate god for the sky and for the land and for the air and for the sun, and they had all these different gods, and their creation story was all about battles between the gods. And once you've read one of those stories, you're reading Genesis 1, it's like, whoa, this is so different. This is about one sovereign God who created everything good, and there's no battles and strife over it. It's God's good creation. So if that's what God's message was to them back then I think that's God's main message for us today, is that God made this world, and it's not... The main purpose in Genesis 1 wasn't to convey the time periods and the exact how of everything, but the who and the why, the purpose of God in creation. So those are the things we hold to today.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another theme in that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes.
Oh yeah, back to the movie. I like science fiction. I love science fiction. I'm a little more into Star Trek and some of those. Doctor Who, love that.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I haven't gotten into Planet of the Apes yet,
but you kind of see science run amok in that movie. Like science
yeah.
can make mistakes, and you'll sometimes hear that science will say, "Oh, this is true," and then a little while later oh, maybe it's not true, like some more evidence came or something. And sometimes in the midst of that, it gets hard to know what to trust, particularly as we're navigating like the integration of science and faith. Science can be like a moving target at times.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate that? Who do we trust? Like, what kind of holds us true in the midst of all that change?
Right. That's a great question. And I've heard it from a lot of people, because I mean, if you're not a scientist, how do you know what scientist to trust? How do you know that Deb Haarsma has anything good to say versus somebody else you hear? And in a way, it's just not very easy. You're right that science does change and develop. So when you hear a news story like there's some discovery that scientists have made, and they'll get all excited about it, and a decent fraction of those discoveries turn out to be incorrect as other scientists come and check their work and redo the experiments. What you don't hear about in the news are the things where scientists have a consensus, where they've developed it carefully, and so you go back 10, 20 years, and the discoveries made then, so those that have panned out, that's something really reliable. So textbooks are usually pretty good at this. Textbooks will pull out the stuff where scientists have consensus. There's also some popular things. A lot of the PBS series are pretty good for teaching some of the mainstream science. The problem is they'll sometimes, not always, but sometimes mix in their atheist worldview. So there's a big series this spring called Cosmos, which is a redo of the Carl Sagan series, but with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And both Sagan and Tyson tended to mix in their atheism and throw these pot shots at religion. So that's frustrating. But if you can, most textbooks are pretty good on that, and they'll just spend a page or two on spin at most, and then most of the time they're just teaching the science. So what's a layperson to do? Well, if you have time, you can read up on some of these things, and you can look for scientists who are well trained in their fields, respected in their fields, read what they have to say. At BioLogos, we try to gather really top quality scientists like that who are also Christians, so that you're not getting that atheistic spin on it, which I think is really helpful.
It is helpful.
Did I answer all your question? Seems like I missed something of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you gave a good answer of it.
All right.
Now, throughout this morning, science and faith, creation and evolution, there are a lot of passionate followers of Christ who disagree on these things.
Yes.
And it can get you can get bogged down in that disagreement. So we want to close this morning with some things that we all agree on, where Christians are on the same page and we think are really, really important. Can you kind of help us land there? What are some areas of agreement?
I'd love to. I mean, this is really important to me. I know probably here in this room, small as this group is, I bet we have quite a wide range of views on this, from people who believe the Earth is young, and then there's people who believe evolution didn't happen. Maybe the Earth is old, but not sure about evolution. And then I believe that evolution did happen. But we do all agree on who the Creator is, that our God, the God we sang praise to this morning, the God who filled the heavens with glory, that is the God who made this whole universe. And so we can disagree about the how and the when while still agreeing on the who and the why. And what really binds us together as Christians is our belief in Jesus Christ. That's the core of our faith. To believe that God is our Savior, that we have all sinned, that we are in need of salvation, and that same Christ is the one through whom all things were created. It teaches in John 1. So the gospel is the center of who we are as Christians. And it's sad when these disagreements overshadow that, where they become somehow more important. And I think it ruins our witness to the world if we're constantly debating and sniping at each other over these things. So they're important issues to discuss, but shouldn't dominate what we do as the church.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Will you join me in thanking Deb?
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.